Depression and some of the things that took it from bad to worse, including Herbert Hoover's poor decision making as president. And we just want to briefly mention too that Herbert Hoover at the time was following the playbook about what a lot of economists thought you should do. That it's not the government's job to necessarily get involved and kind of bail people out if they were in a jam. And he says, listen, this is just part of how the economic system works and that will recover over time. He thought it was the market correcting itself, but people weren't willing to tolerate that, and there are reasons why. Let's talk about some of the problems that people generally encountered. Every year from 1929 through 1932, and 1932 is considered really the peak of the Great Depression. It's the worst year for it, but we're talking about tens of thousands of businesses failing every single year because banks want their money back, businesses don't have it, and businesses many times remember they had overproduced as well, and they're in a jam and they can't cope. So you're going to get tens of thousands of businesses failing every year, and people are frustrated and they want something done. You're also going to see a major loss of income. On average, and you don't have to know these specific numbers, but in 1929, right before the market crashes, the average income for an American family was about $1,600. Or excuse me, $2,300. And by 1932, it had dropped to $1,600. So you're really talking about a loss of about 30 to 35% of your annual income. And when you lose that much income, we're talking about major life changes. You're really trying to get by, and to give that some perspective, think about your parents and their jobs, and ask them, what would you or what would we have to do if we lost a third of our income in a 3 year period? So people are having their businesses fail. There's a massive loss of income, and you're also going to see high rates of unemployment. Right before the market crashes in 1929, unemployment was around 5%, which is typically where you would want it to be. Like we said, there are some people who are always transitioning from one job to the next. And so if your unemployment is usually below somewhere between neighborhood of between 5 to 6%, you're in a good spot. 1932, the unemployment nationally was around 25%. One out of every four able-bodied working adults did not have a job. And that is absolutely frightening to think about. When COVID hit and a lot of people lose their jobs because they're not as considered essential employees and they're sent home, unemployment rate was kind of skyrocketing up to like 19 or 20%. But we really believe to a large extent that would come back. Now, you also see in a crisis situation like that, the government in 2020 responded much differently than they did in 1929, 1930. The government learned its lesson that when something bad or tragic happens like that and people lose jobs, you have to provide something for them. Herbert Hoover did not learn that lesson, but thankfully, both the Trump and Biden administrations did realize you have to provide people with money and opportunities for them to get back on their feet. And so losing income, losing their jobs, failing businesses, this frustrates Americans. But it's going to be a lot worse than what you think. And one of the other problems that develops is that many homeless people start creating little shack towns in major urban areas, places to live. And they mockingly called them Hoovervilles because these are little towns or villages that are Herbert Hoover's fault. And Herbert Hoover obviously didn't want his name attached to this, but these little shack towns are places where people go when they don't have any place to go. There's no running water, there's no real electricity. It's a dangerous place to be because there's not really a police presence. You don't know the people who might be living around you. You don't know how dangerous they may be. This is especially dangerous if you're a woman at the time, also. But major urban areas all had some type of Hooverville, some type of little homeless camp that people set up on their own. And you see people do things like this, try to put together like a little impromptu fire, a place to get warm. They set up little things like this, and you got to appreciate people's sense of humor here. Hard times are still hoovering over us. Ooh, ooh. People who grew up in the Great Depression or lived through it always had a disdain for Herbert Hoover, and It's interesting to see sometimes now historians have a different perspective about him, but he was not well liked by his particular generation. Now, another thing I want to show you in here too, some artwork from the time in the United States, because it can give you an idea of what people are dealing with. Art always imitates life. And this particular piece is called Days of Wrath. That's what the Latin term means up there. You see dark birds, the buildings are collapsing in on the people, they're running away. You see some people jumping out of their buildings. The New York Stock Exchange you can see in the background there as well. There's quite a bit involved, and notice it's sketched in black and white because, um, that's a little more depressing. You don't, color is not going to really play out well here because it's literally a sad time. Now, another example, you see the Brooklyn Bridge here, where there's not hardly anybody out. And if you've ever been to New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge is very active. It is a place where people are always walking or driving across. This is another interesting one here as well. Men struggled mightily at this time because their identity was centered around being a provider for their family. That they had a job, they earned money, and mom took care of the kids at home, took care of the home environment, and men are struggling trying to figure this out. Many men turn to alcohol. Many men run away from their responsibilities and abandon their family. So it's a difficult time to say the least. You can see this one. This is a nice, what we call juxtaposition. You see the statue of George Washington here in Liberty Square, I think in New York City, and you see homeless people at its base. And man, Washington would probably likely be sad if he saw the situation that the country was in at that time. This right here shows you the wasteland and the Dust Bowl and how people had come to terms with that. It's very ominous looking. You've got some farming equipment there, but at the same time, you got these little sand dunes and it looks like a swirling storm in the background. Also, people who were homeless were very creative and inventive at the time. You'd see in a lot of urban areas little hobo code. These homeless people came up with their own code to kind of identify places that were helpful or not so helpful. And these people would mark it up so that you could have an idea of what was going on in the area. A lot of folks were very good to help the homeless, but at the same time, you didn't know the people around you. And so these little symbols and these little codes could help provide you with some information. Now, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1932, and he's got solutions for these problems. He calls them the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. He said we have to provide relief to people, meaning that they need job opportunities, they're going to need straight cash, recovery in terms of getting the economy back on track, and reform, meaning we have to reform our institutions, particularly the banks. And you don't have to remember all of these. What you need to remember are the basics, the concepts of relief, recovery, and reform. I'm not going to quiz people about what the Federal Housing Administration does, although you could probably guess, or the Federal Emergency Relief Act. But the relief, one of the things that they do, and there's no going back from this really institutes the first modern welfare program, that they started giving people cash who were homeless and didn't have any particular jobs. This is something that a lot of people didn't want to take, but they understood it's important, and Franklin Roosevelt said we need to provide money for these people. You also had, in terms of recovery and reform, especially reform, we got to fix the banks. Okay, here's a picture of Franklin Roosevelt at the time, and it's ironic because he's going to come into office as president at a time when the United States is being stricken by poverty like never before, and he's from one of the most wealthiest families in New York City, in the New York City area. Okay, at the time, one of the things they do to correct the problems on the stock market, all companies who are publicly traded stocks have to provide honest information about their financial records. That's something, that way you know what you're investing in. That was part of the Truth and Securities Act. He also established the FDIC, the Federal Depositor Insurance Corporation, that guaranteed your money in a bank. And he said, we got to get people to trust banks again and put their money there. And so he prioritized that reform, those banking reforms, and said, listen, if people start putting their money in banks again, banks will be able to loan out more money, and that'll generate more business opportunities. You see right here people going through a bread line, a soup line, getting everything that they can. You also see this, interesting enough, the one little kid who's at the front of the line doesn't have any shoes on. People, individuals, churches, and other charitable organizations were responsible for putting these things together. Giving out cash to people was definitely something the government implemented as well. We'll talk about some of these other programs in other videos, but the three R's, relief, reform, and recovery, that's Roosevelt's plan.